So one of the talking points we wanted to dive into here was, Till had a unique start to their evolution with the usage of a fractional CTO resource, kind of heading up a lot of the product in the earlier stages, and then you transitioning in as a VPE. If you can maybe just kind of talk through that situation and how it kind of unfolded, and then we can just kind of riff from there.
Yeah, it was actually quite an ideal situation for myself and everyone involved as well. So the fractional CTO who was in place, a guy by the name of Matt Walnut, like he's a real pro. He's done this a bunch before. This is what he does for a living. So one of the things that I was sort of pleasantly surprised coming in was to learn that just enough of the early platform was built out to sort of like get product market fit and prove the hypothesis, the thesis of why Till should exist out in such a way that we got customers on board, people were using it, but things were built in such a way that all decisions were pretty easily reversible. It was a very sort of Zapier approach where you would use like existing SaaS tools, here's a form here, it talks to a thing, maybe there is a database stood up somewhere, but it's, pretty minimal. Just enough technology enablement to get the ball rolling. And so when I came on board, there were two engineers who had just started a couple weeks prior. So we were all actually pretty new coming on board. And so as I came in and I started meeting with Matt and the other engineers and learning about what they had built, it was pretty straightforward to come in and say, okay, I see what you're working on. We're going to take this SaaS enabled product and actually start to build it on our platform so that we can actually scale it to the number of users we want to. And, like I said, it was pretty straightforward. I'm a little worried that like my situation is not indicative of like everyone else's situation. I'm sure a lot of people go into like a big mess and they have to do actually a big, well, they don't have to, they choose to do like things like a cloud migration or rewrite everything in a different programming language. Granted, we did a little bit of that. There just wasn't much to do. Like for instance, a lot of things were in C#, we wanted to do more TypeScript, JavaScript type stuff. And a couple of things running in Azure, and we subsequently moved over to AWS. But again, these things, all in all, took only really a few months as opposed to, upwards of a year or more in some instances.
So a lot of like the technology decisions, were those already in place when you had kind of come in, or did you have a chance to kind of collaborate with Matt and make recommendations, or I guess how did that transfer of knowledge and then the steps moving forward, how did that kind of play out?
Yeah, well, the technology decisions as they exist today, Matt just essentially absolved himself from that. He was of the mind that, this is your team moving forward, build it in the way that you've envisioned it. And I was very appreciative to get that autonomy in the space to do that. And he took nothing personally when I was like, oh man, all this Microsoft tech, nothing against Microsoft, whatever, but like I'm much more of an AWS guy. And so he was like, yeah, you should absolutely do that. Do what is, most comfortable for you and your team. And so that process was pretty straightforward. And so the decisions made thereafter was really about myself and the team I was inheriting, the two engineers. I would obviously ask Matt for advice and, what he thought, and if there were any special insight as to, why things, were working the way they were that I should take into account before we switch things over. And, this wasn't like a one shot cut over, we kept things running for a while, and while we did a little bit of building over here and transition things in such a way that we, didn't disrupt, current users or anything like that. But a lot of decisions were really within, my team with advice from Matt along the way.
So the transition of, Matt kind of phasing out, he still kind of stayed in more of like an advisory type of role, or there to as a sounding board for you to ask questions of, I saw you did this, or this documentation, where was this stored, or he was kind of there as a resource. How much longer, or is he still there today as an advisor? I guess how much longer did that kind of transition take place from when you came in into where it was like kind of a clean separation?
It was a bit of still not done. Matt's in Slack right now. I could ping him if I wanted to. So he's still around in some capacity, but it was very much a slow roll. He was coming into the office a few times a week to do stand up with the team and, catch up on what were people working on and whatnot. So it went from him continuing to do that for about a week to, okay, I think I got it now. I can run stand up. I can do this. At this point, I knew exactly what the team was working on and how we should proceed forward. Then it was more like every couple of weeks he would come in, we'd have lunch or something like that, just kind of catch up. Then it was like, every couple months. And then at some point it was just, let me know if you need anything in Slack. And so every so often, like he'll still ping me. I often figure he's in there as a guest. He'll just ping me and say, hey, I've been following what's going on. Everything looks really good. Let me know if you want to catch up. And that tends to lead to some sort of conversation. But, there was no quote unquote clean break. He's still sort of around in a lot of ways.
Cool. And so from the onset of you coming in as the VP, I'm curious about the kind of like the interview process and how much of a part that fractional CTO plays in, I guess, validating who the right resource is going to be coming in here, right? Because you've got a couple of things. Well, how many employees was Till when you kind of came in?
I want to say anywhere from between 12 to 15, something like that.
And so the founder, CEO, probably was obviously a part of the interview process. And then, yeah, I'm curious to hear about what that interview process looked like from almost like buying into the vision discussions to buying into the technology with the CTO and all these other pieces.
Yeah, so it started off with our founder, David Sullivan. The first part of the interview was in a Compass coffee shop in Chinatown. And so I met with David. It must have been about 2 hours. We had just a really good conversation. He gave me an overview of the business and he talked about where he saw the platform going. He comes from the real estate industry, so he's not really a product tech guy, but he does have an understanding of how technology enables the product he wants to build. And so we talked a lot about that and how he saw data playing a big part of that strategy. So I was able to engage with him at a very high level about my thoughts about that and like how I would approach it. So that was really good conversation. And then the next step was to bring me into the office to actually meet with him again, but also Matt, who was the fractional CTO at the time. And that was sort of like the meat of the interview. So David just kind of like sat there. He asked a couple of questions, but it was really just like Matt. I mean, I don't know what they talked about outside of my presence, but I got, the sense that he was essentially just like validating on behalf of David, sort of my technical background. We got a little bit deeper in the weeds and we talked about data and data strategy. And, there were a few tangents about, specific technologies and how to solve specific problems, and we did talk a bit about building teams and stuff like that. It was a very sort of broad interview. I mean, the job of VP of engineering, like kind of especially that early, spans pretty much everything, from hiring to building teams to technology strategy and all these other things. And so we really touched on a bunch of that stuff. Then after that interview, I interviewed with the couple engineers who were already there, a couple guys, and we went a little bit deeper and we got into very specific technology questions and asked me a bunch about my leadership style and my expectations and things like that.
Cool. Yeah, when interviewing, was there pieces of the interview where you had maybe clear-cut questions about what does the timeline look like for me coming in and taking everything fully over? Was that transparent from the start, or was there still like some obscurity and it was like, well, we'll play it by ear based on how you come up to speed? But I just put myself in your shoes and I would want to know, a couple of things like, well, what's my progression to maybe if I want to become the CTO, or, how long are we planning to rely on a fractional resource before it's all on my plate?
Yeah, I mean, we did have explicit conversations and the feedback was, it was all on me. How soon could I get comfortable enough with what we were doing and my relationship with the team to actually just take everything over, right? And that could have taken a while. It could have been very soon. It was really on me. You know, Matt was very generous with his time, and he basically let me know, I will be here for as long as you need me to be here, to make sure that we have a successful handoff. And so he was very generous about that. Actually, didn't take very long for me to come on board, simply because it was so early. Not much had been built, just a few key things, and so it didn't take me very long to sort of get my head around what was there and what we were trying to build. And at that point, everything else was just implementation details, if you know what I mean. So it didn't take very long, but if I needed a longer time to kind of transition, Matt was supportive, David was supportive, and I think it would have been totally fine.
Nice. Were there certain things that Matt and maybe David had done really well to make this a more seamless transition? If it was documentation, all of the code in a GitHub repo, whatever it was, were there things that were done really well that made this more of a smoother transition than maybe wouldn't have been for other companies that have taken the approach?
Um, I think giving me the autonomy to just jump in, in a certain way, it's kind of specific to the person you're bringing on board, right? I work best when I'm just sort of like handed a problem and just kind of left to my own devices to sort of like figure things out. And so I was handed this product that did exist in a certain way, but we needed to get it to a place where we can scale to like a few more users, and we needed to get information onto our platform. Like I understood this very clearly, and so I was able to work with the team to get there. So the best thing they were able to do, honestly, was just kind of go hands off, answer my questions if I had any, but being very sort of unopinionated and saying like, it's your show, make the decisions. Like that was probably the best thing. I think I probably would have struggled a little bit if I, had been encountering roadblocks like, oh, you can't do that because that, oh, you can't do that because of that. Or it's like, come on guys, you got to get the handcuffs off if you want me to like do this. I did not run into those issues. And so I think that they did a really good job of sort of just, handing things off and being as hands off as possible.
Yeah, it's a good point. I could see where, butting heads with a consultant at that point could cause some issues. So going into it and having kind of seen it through, for other early stage companies that are taking this type of approach to
Mm-hmm.
building their team, what were there any things that you think that could have been added in to make it a better experience, or any I guess quick tips that you would point out to other founders that are taking this approach?
Yeah, I'd say take the same approach of, not being too invested in what you're building on day one. Like I really like the SaaS Zapier approach that they took initially. Like they did use just enough technology to solve a problem and nothing more. Um, Definitely take that approach. You don't want to get too tied to anything. Like even now, if someone were to drop in today into Till, and for whatever reason I was on my way out, you know, it's really all about solving the problem at hand and not getting too attached to what had come before. Granted, you want to respect the work of people who were there previously, but the thing that you really want to focus on is really making sure you're handing problems to your leadership and not necessarily recipes to implement. Um, and I want to recognize again that like I was extremely fortunate because I came in so early. If this were to happen now at Till stage, it would be a completely different ball game. Like we're deeply embedded in AWS. We have a product that serves a lot more customers than we did at that time, and so a handoff would take a lot longer today because not only is the technology important, but just the people, right? I have a special relationship with all of my engineers who report to me. And so when you take over, it's not just the technology or a department you're taking over people's careers and their growth and their guidance, right? When I talk to people, when we have one-on-ones, it's not just about what have you been working on, but it's about like, what do you want to do? Like, how do you want to grow? Do you see yourself in leadership? These sorts of things. You have to hand off that knowledge and everything. And so that's a much harder task than coming in and passing over a few passwords and saying this is how we're doing it.
Yeah, that certainly seems like. Plus, I mean, not as much like technical debt. It's still a little bit
Mm-hmm.
early stage where they're not so vested in all of these decisions, and then somebody come in and kind of, well, let's recreate something.
Yeah,
So.
I would also advise people not to change things for the sake of change. Make sure there's a there's a reason for it.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, because that could be highly disruptive.
Are there specific like traits or attributes that stick out that this model, this fractional CTO concept fits better for than others? If maybe you could, if a couple of things like come to mind that you would point out.
For the fractional CTO or the person
Yeah.
replacing them? I think, yeah, for a fractional CTO, you probably need to be a bit more solutions oriented. And like I said, not too invested in the specific technology. I would have had a harder time had, Matt been like very bullish about staying in Azure for whatever reason. Um, and you have to be pretty confident in what you've done and like how you've brought the team along, because it could be very easy for people to get very defensive about decisions they've made, right? And when someone wants to go in and make a different decision, if you're not confident in what you were trying to achieve, you may be a bit sensitive to people like changing things. But having the confidence to know that when you made a decision, you were just trying to solve a problem. And if someone comes in and they have a better way of doing it or more long-term vision in a different solution, being on board with that decision is really, really important. And also it's good for just respecting that person's space as they come in and try to get their arms around that team. So I think, having confidence in their decision making, and also just being very self-aware about who they are and about not getting too invested in the way things are.
Cool. Yeah, that's great info. And I know that in startups, especially the earlier you get, titles can mean many different things.
Mm-hmm.
You came in with the title of vice president of engineering, but your role was probably that of a CTO. Coming in the door. You recently were promoted as the CTO. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What was that? I guess that from the time that you came in to now, I guess, how long had you been there? And taking that title over, did it come with additional responsibilities, or was it kind of similar to what you were already doing as the VP?
Yeah, so I'd been in the VP role for a little over a year. And so the transition, 90% of it is exactly the same. I still have my team. We're still building a product. I'm working with our product manager to kind of help with delivery. The last 10% is sort of like the unseen work. That's me working with David and the rest of the executive team to help push forward the business strategy, and not necessarily just being the representative of the tech team within that team itself, and really being challenged on how do we use data in a responsible way, in a secure way, understanding that we could be dealing with vulnerable populations, and making sure that we're doing right by all of our customers, both the residents and the landlords, and looking out for their best interests, and making sure we're secure in the future of the company. Like these were conversations that would pop up every so often in the VP role, but now it's much more of an expectation moving forward. So it's a little bit more on my plate, but I welcome the challenge for sure.
Cool. Awesome. I think those are all really interesting points, and I think the concept. It's an area that we've always been really fascinated with. I think it's something that is going to be more and more rolled out. Kind of giving uncertainty in the economy, the hesitancy to vest into a W-2 CTO off the break. I think this is a methodology that's going to be more and more rolled out, and so I think this will be really helpful for those folks that are those founders that are trying to take a different, more creative approach.
Yeah, and it's definitely a good approach when you just want to take your time, right? When you fill that role, that's a big role. This is the person who you're going to trust to build out your engineering organization, particularly if you're in David's situation and you don't come from a product and engineering background. You really, really, really need to trust that this person will do the right thing, make the right choices, build the right team, all that stuff. And so if you need to take your time and look for that person, then I think that's a great strategy to incorporate.